Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you're all doing well and thank you as always for being here. It's great to have you along, and joining me on this episode we've got, as always, Lee Wallington on the panel. Hello Lee.
Adam, how you doing?
Pretty good. It was an interesting Japanese Grand Prix. I don't think it was a cult classic by any stretch of the imagination, but there was a lot of strategy going on and a lot of offsets of strategy, and I think that made the race a rather intriguing watch, albeit the inevitable outcome that we all expected to happen did happen.
The black and white flag.
Black and white flag. Well, we certainly had a few flags out there that we expected to see in the race, and the Japanese Grand Prix often throws them up, and we did see them, but no, I'm of course referring to Max Verstappen and Red Bull absolutely controlling the race from start to finish. Obviously, as I said, the strategy did throw a few curveballs, but there was never really any doubt that Red Bull and Max Verstappen in particular were going to be dominant, and Checo Perez obviously consolidating that with a very solid P2 as well. Class of the field, class of the competition. Normal service resumed for Red Bull, Lee.
Yeah, very much so. It was obviously a track that obviously does reward aero efficiency and driver prowess, and it just shows you that, especially Max Verstappen's hands, that car is pretty mighty around Suzuka.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Before we start with the race review, as always, we like to pay tribute to a 5-star review that we receive. And of course, we always ask you guys that follow the show to send us in a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting platform, preferably Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you can. And also, as part of the review, please let us know why you love the show. And as a way of saying thanks, we read your review out on the show for everyone to hear how much you love the show. And for this one, we've got sound like Scooby-Doo there. We've got a 5-star review from Madden0909 on Apple Podcasts. And Madden says, the perfect after race podcast. Absolutely love the podcast. So thank you very much, Madden0909. This podcast episode is dedicated to you. So thank you very much. As I said already, guys, get your 5-star reviews in. Let us know why you love the show, and we will read them out on a future episode. So Lee, as part of the review, the new format that we're doing this season, we ask for your highlight of the race. If I may, I would like to throw my highlight first, because I think timeliness of it is probably relevant. And my highlight has to be the incident between Daniel Ricciardo and Alex Albon very early on. We got a lot of questions from our followers to this, and majority of them were asking our thoughts on that incident between Ricciardo and Albon. Who was at fault? Was anybody at fault? The stewards deemed it a racing incident. For me, I think it's pretty much as simple as that. I think it was a bit of clumsiness from both drivers off the start. Sometimes these incidents can happen. I think that's pretty much what we saw here.
Yeah, I definitely think it was a racing incident. There was no one driver at fault. It was really, it was a mix of 3 drivers, which one you didn't include was obviously Stroll, because he was on the outside of Daniel, and Daniel was reacting to Stroll, and then obviously Alex was in the inside. Depending on which way you want to put it in the corner, because obviously coming up to the next corner, Lance was on the inside and Alex was on the outside. But out of the previous corner, it was obviously that way around. It was just a sort of 3 into 1 doesn't really go, and it just, unfortunately, it was Daniel and Alex that were the ones that didn't go into that next corner. Simple racing incident, unfortunately.
No, I absolutely agree. The stewards felt no reason to punish either driver. Obviously, they investigated it, but there was absolutely no reason, in my opinion, to do that. And I understand some people. I remember when I was watching the race and looking through social media, obviously the red flag was brought out as a result of this, so we had a bit of a delay, although it wasn't the longest delay that we've seen at Suzuka. It was about 15, 20 minutes just to get the barrier fixed, get the cars out the way, and then restart the race. A lot of people were given their opinions. Quite a few people felt that Ricciardo was at fault, but it's one of those, as you said, Lee, where you've got 3 drivers in that part of the track. Stroll obviously was the innocent party in all of this, even though he was in that vicinity. There was the assumption that Stroll had done something to at least scare Ricciardo, or at least shock him and force him to go into Albon, but no, he did nothing of the sort. Obviously, he was on the inside going through the S's. Ricciardo was obviously mindful of him. He was watching Stroll in his mirrors, moves to the right-hand side, obviously not aware that Alex Albon has manoeuvred his Williams into that position on the outside, and Alex gets caught up in the incident. For me, as I said, racing incident already. I just don't feel, especially if, the first lap, there's always a bit of leeway for these incidents when they happen because everyone's so bunched up off the start. But for me, I think it's two things that cause this incident. First of all, Daniel Ricciardo not checking both sides and being a bit clumsy, albeit he is very much heavily focused on what's going on the inside of him, and will obviously think no one's going to go to that position where Albon ends up. And also, I think there is a bit of clumsiness from Albon as well, perhaps to try and put his car in a position where he was putting himself at risk. And I think sometimes people often overlook in these moments when you're racing along and you put your car in a position where the onus becomes that of the other driver to not move into that position and, end up contributing to an incident. And I think for that reason, they're both as guilty as each other in this incident in terms of both of their races being ended. So I, for one, if I was a steward, couldn't really find grounds to punish either one of them for this incident and just say, look, racing incident, they're both bunched up. It can happen sometimes. That's racing.
Yeah, especially just obviously the point of Alex. If you're on trying to overtake on the outside, you've got to be fully aware that that's a risk that the driver on the inside could drift out intentionally or accidentally. There's a chance of oversteer or understeering the turn in the corner. The likelihood of having some contact increases trying to go around the outside unless you've got that massive speed advantage to outbrake in around the outside. And Alex obviously took that gamble, but yeah, he's also partly in fault in that. But there is a silver lining because obviously Daniel gets a new chassis and he's been blaming the chassis for his recent troubles. So Daniel could be happy that he got involved in the incident.
Well, Alex Albon knows how to break his chassis in Formula One, although I'm not sure Daniel Ricciardo would have asked him to do him a favour and try and see if he could break his chassis so he can get a new one, Lee. But never know.
The team RB did say no to a new chassis because they don't believe it is any issue, but Daniel did think it was an issue, but now he's getting a new chassis. So I think if Daniel's on form in China, then we know he was right.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing some headlines about Williams, it's going to cost, I think it's cost them $2 million over the last couple of weeks to repair the chassis that Alex had previously damaged, which was given to Logan subsequently, and now probably the damage from this particular incident as well. So it's not been fun for Williams at the moment. As quick as Alex Albon has been for them, he's proven to be quite expensive in terms of damage to the car, which obviously, for a driver of his talent in stock, and there's a lot of it in equal measure, it's not going to do him any favours for his future prospects if there are teams looking at him and thinking, look, well, we could take a risk on him, but he is quite expensive in terms of car repairs and car damage. And obviously a team like Williams can't afford to be wasting money that they very much need to be putting into development on fixing a car.
Yeah, obviously at the moment, how the tables are turned regarding teammate repair costs. But if Alex brings back the points, then maybe there's obviously a risk-reward factor that teams will have to consider if that is something that they will do overall. But yeah, Alex has been a bit overeager recently, which is obviously unnecessary costs, unfortunately. And he's better than the incidents he's been involved in, so he does need to tidy himself up a little bit.
Yeah, very much so. It's hardly been a stellar start to the season for Alex Albon, especially when it is proving to be very difficult to score points at the current point in time unless you're driving one of the top 5 cars right now. It is quite difficult, but obviously you can't afford to be crashing your car. We did get one interesting question, Lee, and I think this is worth asking because it was quite funny when I saw this, from Jay in the Outhouse. Now, you can tell I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel social media for some of these questions, but we appreciate you sending them in to us at DNF1_official on Twitter and, of course, on Facebook as well. We ask for your questions for the podcast episodes. And Jay writes, could Williams have given Alex Albon Logan Sargent's car at the restart after his first lap crash with Ricciardo during the red flag interval? Short answer, no, they couldn't have done. We wouldn't have got a situation like, who was it? Was it Mike Hawthorne and, I'm trying to think the other driver. It wasn't John Surtees, was it? Or was it, Manuel Fangio? Yeah, that's it. It was Fangio that his teammate gave him his car many, many years ago, like trying to stretch my F1 history here. No, the short answer to that one, Jay, is no, they couldn't have done that. Simply put, for two reasons. One, because once qualifying has been done, or once they've took part in qualifying, they're locked in parc ferme. So they couldn't have done what they did in Australia and give Alex Logan's car before qualifying. So they couldn't have done that for the race. And even if they could have done, there was that part with the red flag where everybody thought the order was going to be reset from the original grid. But because the leaders had passed the first sector before the red flag came out, that gave the stewards an official timing screen that they could use to make the grid going forward. So obviously, because Logan had passed that, he's classified in the race. Obviously, Williams probably wouldn't have done this, but they couldn't have given Alex Logan's car at that point anyway. So yeah, if they'd have done that, they'd have been disqualified. So that's I thought that was quite humorous because, you know, given the landscape of everything at the moment, you wouldn't put it past Williams of trying to do that. But these crashes Alex is getting involved in, whether this one was his fault or not, they are proven to be very expensive.
Yeah, I do think it's a valid question because it's obviously you don't see it happen very often. What happened last time out in Australia regarding cars being reassigned. So just obviously clarifying on that, I think it's valid, and it's the days of spare cars as well is long gone. Crash and jump in another car and go off racing again is it's Alex does need to sort himself out of it.
Yeah, I mean, if they could have done it, they probably would have tried, but obviously they wouldn't have been allowed to do that, so that's obviously why it was never entertained. As I said, I'm not sure if that was a serious question or not. I thought it was funny when I saw it, so I thought I'd have to share this on the podcast just for the vibes more than anything else. Lee, let's go to your memorable moment. What was your highlight of the race?
So it is part of the race, but it's probably a overall boring part of the race because it's the pit lane. But my memorable moment was when we was 5 cars coming to the pits at the same time, and it was just basically a stop clock race about who can do the quickest pit stop and get out back onto the track as soon as possible. And obviously the local hero Yuki was the first one out. There obviously the crowd goes ecstatic that he's obviously gained a place in the pits. I think one place he gained in the pit stop.
It was 2 actually. I think it was the fight for P11, wasn't it? Between Sargent, Bottas, Tsunoda, Magnussen and Stroll all came in at the same time, and RB got Tsunoda out of all of them, which was a great job for them and helped him get that P10 in the end.
Yeah, I mean, you don't normally get excited about a pit stop, mind you, but yeah, that was really obviously well done to the RB pit crew, but it was a really entertaining part about who's going to get out first and who's going to get that track advantage. And for me, I thoroughly enjoyed that little bit of off-track action.
Yeah, it was a little disappointing because when the race director eventually came to that, we saw them all coming out back onto the track, and it was all 5 of them. I was like, what on earth has gone on here? It's a bit crazy. And then we saw the replay, and it was, very crazy stuff. All teams hands on deck. Half the pit crews were on it, and it was the RB team that did a great job for the home favourite Tsunoda. As soon as he got out, the crowd let up a big roar. He was off, and another great drive from Tsunoda as well. I mean, there's not really too much more to say on Yuki Tsunoda. The many people were absolutely delighted to see this weekend Yuki really putting another stellar drive. He's just driving really, really well at the moment, isn't he, Lee?
Yeah, he's really coming on form and showing why he deserves his spot in F1. I know I've said it before, and we've said it before in previous years that does he really deserve to be in the sport? He needed to step up, and he's clearly stepped up. And I'm put on the praise because there was a time that we had the discussion, did he even deserve to be in the sport? And I'm so glad that he's proven us wrong, that he'd shown that he deserves to be in the sport. And it's obviously a great home race for him. Yes, it's not the win, it's not a podium, but it's still a solid performance at home, entertaining the local crowd. And it does hurt a little bit that he's out of the question for that Red Bull seat, because he's doing everything to show why he should be considered. But there's obviously other politics going on behind the scenes that probably is impacting that. But it's really lovely to see Yuki doing so well this weekend.
Yeah, I agree. He's proven to be the best driver other than Max Verstappen and maybe Sergio Perez to a degree at the moment that Red Bull seem to have. And, it's one of those where even if Red Bull isn't looking at Yuki Tsunoda, I'm sure there are others that are. And as I said already, maybe there are connections to Honda and other elements that could facilitate a move for Yuki Tsunoda to another team, a team that might appreciate him a little bit more. But I think what he's doing at the moment, Lee, which is very important for him, he's maturing, he's being much more consistent, he's letting his pace speak for himself, he's not making mistakes anymore, at least as many as he used to, and he's delivering week after week after week. And I think this was his third successive points finish since 2021, or it might actually be his third top 10 since 2021. I might be mixing those two up. Even still, great stuff from Yuki Tsunoda. I'm absolutely thrilled to see him doing really well, and I hope he can keep that going forward. Right now, outside the top 9, he's by far the best of everybody else. He might be driving the best car of everyone else except for Stroll, but he's certainly proving that as well. So no, good on Yuki Tsunoda. Keep that up, I think is the best way to put it. Let's move back to Red Bull, Lee. So once again, Max Verstappen winning. It looks like Max is back on form again, back on the top step of the podium. 57 wins now in his career, third straight victory at Suzuka, equaling a record that Michael Schumacher had put many years ago. He absolutely loves this circuit, and so do Red Bull by the looks of it.
Yeah, obviously, very, very happy track for Red Bull historically. Obviously, they did have wrapped up titles here in the past. But it's, as we said in the qualifying, it's a driver track, and the really technical drivers really enjoy the challenge of the track, regardless of the car that they have. Obviously, they all love to win, but they enjoy the challenge of the track, and it's fun to drive. But yeah, Max just really seems to be on it. There was obviously questions before the race regarding their tyre life, and they're obviously the hotter conditions, but Red Bull put that to sleep quite well and just showed emphatically that, yeah, what question issues would they be concerned about? What then the question was answered. We have no problem.
Simple as that, really, isn't it? Yeah, no problem at all. A quick one on Sergio Perez. We got a good question from Lana Rayner on this, and this is a question we've already discussed, and I feel like we're going to get asked this a lot throughout this season until we find out what happens with him. But Lana asks, Sergio Perez has now got 3 second-place finishes in the first 4 races this season. Do you think if he continues this form and remains at least P2 in the championship, Red Bull will definitely keep him on for 2025? As I said, I think that's just going to be a question for every single race this season, Lee. We've certainly asked it a few times already. I just don't think it's as simple as that anymore. As I said, I think Sergio Perez's form has been good so far this season. Unfortunately, that race in Australia is proof that Sergio Perez, hasn't been reliable enough to deliver that result for Red Bull when Max Verstappen isn't able to. And because of that, there is that doubt that's always going to loom over him as being that guy Red Bull can rely on. Especially in a situation if Max Verstappen, for whatever reason, decides to leave the team. Not that I think that will happen, but it's no longer about will it be Perez or will it be Ricciardo. Honestly, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think that's going to happen now, not even in Christian Horner's most amazing fantasy regarding Ricciardo. I don't think that's going to happen anymore. But you've got the added element now with drivers like Carlos Sainz, Fernando Alonso, maybe not so much now, but Lando Norris was also another factor in this, and Oscar Piastri to a degree as well. You've got so many other drivers that would want to be in that seat that I think can argue a very good case to be put in that seat for Red Bull, and it no longer means that Sergio Perez is probably the best driver you can put in that car that Red Bull have available. They've spoken countless times now, especially in Melbourne, we heard this a lot from Christian Horner, that Red Bull are keeping an eye out on drivers outside of their program and maybe need to look beyond that. The last time they did that, they signed Sergio Perez when they did that. So for me, I don't think there's any reason why Red Bull's position on Perez is going to change just because he put in arguably his most impressive performance this season, when you're always going to think that there's a Melbourne performance in Checo every other race he does at the moment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think him long-term securing P2 in the championship is going to be enough for him to keep his seat. There is so many different factors that you already said. I think another factor should be considered is obviously we got behind the scenes. You have like Liberty and Formula One pushing Red Bull to have a more competitive number 2 driver, because obviously they're concerned from viewing numbers, people were getting bored, switching off. Which there is interest is going down. That's already been confirmed by multiple outlets. So they want that title fight at the front, and they want that inter-team battle and they're obviously putting in pressure on Red Bull to have that fight. So there's all that extra external pressure on top of the reasons you said as well. So I don't think it's Sergio securing P2 is going to be enough at all to keep his seat.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And as I said already, with the outside the Red Bull driver program factor now being quite apparent with Red Bull, because they've openly admitted that that's what they've been doing, I think that just changes the game completely. And, with Sergio Perez, the option I think Red Bull... do you remember early in the season when Red Bull had put an option to sign Alex Albon back into the team for 2026? For me, that just screamed of, okay, we're aware of your situation at Williams. We're going to respect that. We'll potentially put you in the car in 2026 if you keep doing what you're doing. But before then, that was at the time when Red Bull thought the only other option for them was Ricciardo or keep Perez on. So Perez was always on a year by year basis, like Mercedes were with Bottas, until eventually that next young driver comes along. And at the time, it was Albon. But now Fernando Alonso's in the mix. Carlos Sainz is in the mix. It's almost as if Lewis Hamilton going to Ferrari has now created this chasm in the driver market where all of a sudden Red Bull have their pick at almost any other driver that's realistically available and good options out there, where Perez is now competing against so many other drivers where I just don't think you can argue a case to keep him unless Red Bull feel that they are happy to accept every other day where Checo's nowhere near at the races, but he still comes second most of the time for them. It's up to them to decide if that's suitable for them, but I'm just not sure long term that's going to work.
No, and you think, or even over the course of this season, at some point, relatively soon, in the next couple of months, Red Bull will probably switch attention to next year, and the chasing pack won't, and the gap will close. And towards the end of the season, Sergio may find it harder and harder to secure that P2 position as the fight. The chasing pack closes the gap, and if 25 is even closer, then they may not be even sure that Sergio can be enough to actually maintain that, and the chasing pack has overtaken them. So I do think personally this is going to be his last year within the Red Bull family.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, at the time, I thought Perez was going to stay, but until the market opened up, I just don't really... I can't justify Red Bull turning down Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso to keep Perez without a very good reason to do that. I just can't see that happening, because it's almost like we're waiting for someone better to come along. Well, who is available and who is better than Sainz or Alonso to want to keep Perez a bit longer and wait for? I don't know. Unless Lando Norris becomes available, I just don't see the logic behind that. Anyway, look, we should move on to Ferrari. Now, Sunday worked out pretty well for Ferrari, albeit they weren't really challenging Red Bull, and I'm sure some people were going to be disappointed, hoping that they might be able to challenge Red Bull a bit. I wasn't so confident because I just felt Suzuka is a Red Bull circuit, it's a Verstappen circuit, it's a driver circuit as we established. So, even though Ferrari have a good solid car, and I think they proved that again this weekend, that they have a very good car on their hands, they just have to try and improve it to a point where they can challenge Red Bull. Everything has to go perfectly for them, and everything has to go wrong for Red Bull to make that happen. We've got a good question following the P3 and P4 for Sainz and Leclerc respectively from XA Ander, and he writes, Ferrari did a great job with the one stop for Leclerc. Obviously, we'll talk about that a bit later on. But if they had made Carlos Sainz do the same strategy as Leclerc today, could they have beaten Red Bull, or at least one of them? What do you think, Lee?
I don't think so. I think they did the sensible strategic option of splitting their strategy. One worked out one way or the other, and I think the two-stop was the fastest strategy over effective one-stopping. And I think that was the outcome was that they were fighting for the third and fourth position today. I don't think challenging for P2 or the win was really on the table at all. It was just to which order the Ferrari drivers will secure 3 and 4.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I just don't see a scenario where, unless something crazy happens, Ferrari just didn't have the speed to beat Red Bull today. I think Carlos Sainz did a very good job. And the reason, look, the two-stopper was definitely the fastest strategy. I think Ferrari and Red Bull had the right idea on what tyres to go on because they saved 2 sets of mediums and 1 set of hards, whereas a lot of the other teams had 1 set of mediums and 2 sets of hards. And obviously that is relevant for something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on regarding another driver and another team. But Ferrari had the right tyres available to make that strategy work, as did Red Bull. So in a straight fight, I was looking at a graph of all the tyre degradation on average for the drivers. Carlos Sainz's tyre deg is good, but it's not great. It's nowhere near as good as what Leclerc managed. So if Carlos Sainz had done the one stop, he wouldn't have beaten Red Bull. He probably wouldn't have even finished on the podium. I think it might have gone a bit wrong for him, and Leclerc might have even got him. If Leclerc, however, had done the exact same race but started in P3, he could have challenged Perez possibly. But I'm saying could. And the reason I say that is because I'm looking at this graph. As I said, I think this was from F1 Multiview. I'm not 100% sure on this one. But it's a fairly reputable source that has provided this. Charles Leclerc's tyre deg on average per lap during that 28 lap stint was a loss of 0.05 seconds per lap. He was losing, half a tenth per, or not even half a tenth, actually, sorry, 0.005 of a second per lap on tyre deg. That is insane. There's practically no tyre deg at all over that 28 lap stint on average. The next fastest was Magnussen, who was losing about 0.08 seconds, which is still good, but Leclerc's, there was no tyre deg at all. So he drove a phenomenal recovery on the one stopper, albeit it was forced by the fact that he started so far down because of his poor qualifying performance relative to his teammate. But it just shows the pace is there for Ferrari. But as I said already, I just don't think there was a realistic metric that you could show me that would suggest that Ferrari could have beat Red Bull today on pure pace. It just wasn't there. Red Bull were too good today.
Yeah, completely. But I do find that interesting regarding his degradation. That's ridiculous. Well done, but ridiculous.
Well, it was phenomenal, and he deserved driver of the day, Charles Leclerc. As I said, that 28 lap stint was absolutely brilliant to stay out long. Carlos was, his tyre deg was fine, but his race was sound. It was a simple 2-stop strategy like the Red Bulls after the red flag. They managed it really well, clearly had the pace to be comfortable, got on the podium towards the end of the race. Ferrari managed that pretty well. I don't think anyone would have complained about Ferrari asking Leclerc to move out of Sainz's way. Sainz had too much pace for him anyway, so it's still a good day from Ferrari. The question, obviously, Lee, is not necessarily about Ferrari, will they have the pace to beat Red Bull? If Ferrari get into a position where they're challenging Red Bull, what they can't afford is for Leclerc to have an off day in qualifying and then have to recover it on a Sunday. As great as it was, he's kind of compromised himself in that position by not doing a better job on Saturday. It's as simple as that, really.
Yeah, which is ironic considering most people in the grid think Charles is the fastest over one lap, and he's the one that's making the mistakes, or not getting it, not really mistakes, but not getting the full package of the car in working in a satisfactory condition for him. So it's just the slight irony on that is showing, but I'm sure he'll get on top of that and he'll be sorting out his Saturdays rather soon. Yeah,
he said as we talked about this in the quali review on Saturday, that it was one of those where they just didn't get the tyre warm up properly. His final sector wasn't great, and he lost 3 tenths to Max in the final sector. If he had just reduced that a little bit and been on par with the other drivers around him, he probably would have been on the second row of the grid. Then maybe would have got the answer to that question. Maybe Ferrari would have gone aggressive with Leclerc and said, yeah, do that stint, see if you can beat one of the Red Bulls today, or cause a bit of panic amongst them. But no, it's something for him to think about. But there's only a tenth between the two Ferraris, but obviously Sainz starting on the second row and Leclerc starting all the way back with Russell and Hamilton. Obviously, it's not where he would want to be most weekends. He needs to be up there with his teammate. But once again, Lee, Carlos Sainz, the only driver right now to have finished on the podium for every race he started. He's doing exactly what he needs to be doing for a driver that is currently unemployed at the moment, or it will be next year.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can't say I jest, but definitely should it have been Carlos and Lewis next year at Ferrari and not Charles?
Well, I mean, the way things are going, people are saying, what's wrong with Ferrari just keeping the lineup they currently have? But obviously, we're not going to get that. Marketing. Well, if it's down to marketing, you're not getting rid of Leclerc. But no, as I said, we've talked about this already, and it's a shame it has to happen. But Carlos is doing absolutely everything he needs to prove to everybody on the grid, including the team that's letting him go, that this is the guy that you should have in your car. But I'm not surprised. I know you're not surprised, but smooth operator, doing smooth operator things.
Well, it's what he's developed his reputation for, and I'm really happy to see him keeping his podium streak going. Let's see how long it can last.
Yeah, absolutely. We got an interesting question on McLaren from Siempre McLaren, and they ask, did McLaren's aggressive strategy with Lando Norris cost him a podium today? And this is interesting because Lando Norris, people were touting him as the overtake king this weekend, and he put on some really good overtakes. I think the best of the lot was going around the outside of turn 1 of Lewis Hamilton. It was a really late move. Obviously, at the time they were fighting for position, even though Hamilton and Russell were on a bit of an obscure strategy from Mercedes as the race went on. But it was a great move. But Lando wasn't overly buoyant about that. He was saying it doesn't feel great when you start third and then just go backward, despite the praise he was getting. And I understand that because, as I said, a lot of people were praising him. I'm thinking, well, it couldn't have been that great a race for them because they lost 2 places. And one of them was to a car that was much further down the order and probably wasn't even racing them. But Lando went on to say that you're in a losing battle with these guys because they can do a lot more, go longer, extend, talking about Ferrari and maybe even Red Bull. I'm kind of surprised as we boxed early as we did. We covered George, which I didn't think we needed to, but we'll discuss that after in the briefing. So what do you reckon, Lee? Were McLaren, I won't say aggressive because, judging by what Lando's saying, I think he's quite the opposite. They were probably very cautious or too conservative. Did you think McLaren potentially cost Lando a podium today on strategy?
I think there's a case to say that. I think they were concerned about Mercedes' strategy, thinking it was a podium positioning strategy, which it didn't turn out to be that. But they thought, they're going to one stop and they're going to be ahead and we need to cover them off. And they got so focused on Mercedes' strategy that, as I said, didn't work, that it didn't run their own race, which I think is what they should have done. They should have done what was best from their tyre life and the car and focus on what they could achieve more than what someone else was doing. That could have been the thing that cost Lando fight for the podium. I think there was a good case to be made on that. But also McLaren, compared to Ferrari and Red Bull, seem to have a harsher tyre life. So there may be a question that the tyres may have already been gone at that point, or tyre wear, I should have said. And it could be a case that they had to pit because the tyres were gone, and that was it. And there was no argument, and that was the race result because that's what they could achieve. I don't know what his tyre wear was at that point. But definitely, I think they were too focused on Mercedes when they didn't need to be.
Yeah, it's a strange one because Lando pitted. Well, the first stop was quite early anyway, because obviously he was trying to get that massive undercut. And at the time, it was sort of working, went onto the hard tyres. And this was because McLaren only really had one set of mediums and 2 hards. They didn't have any fresh mediums to put on other than the tyres he had at the start. So there was already that difference there with Ferrari where McLaren felt, we'll see how we go. And I think perhaps McLaren felt that Carlos had the pace on him and he was going to beat him anyway. So perhaps they were going to try and cover off Leclerc. But nobody anticipated the strategy Leclerc ended up doing and how well he did in that, which ultimately got him into that position where he could get ahead of Norris. And once he was ahead of Norris after that pit stop where Norris went in with him, that was it. I think in terms of that chance of beating Leclerc. So, and it didn't help Lando either. Ended up coming out behind, I think it was George Russell he came out behind as well. So it was very, very tight in that pack. And I get Norris's point. That second stop that they made, they did pick quite early on the hards to try and cover George off. Obviously, it didn't work, and then he had to overtake him again, and George pitted again anyway, so it didn't even matter. I don't know, Lee. I think if Norris goes a bit longer like Sainz did, perhaps, or maybe somewhere near that, maybe his tyres will be fresh enough where he could have potentially hunted down Leclerc to get him. But I also think you have to factor in what happened with Alonso in particular, that Alonso went quite long, put on a fresh set of tyres near the end, and he never was really able to make up the ground. If anything, he got bogged down into a battle with Norris's teammate Piastri. So I don't necessarily agree that McLaren messed up on strategy today. I think they could have beat Leclerc if they'd have tried to aim to fight Sainz, but I think McLaren just conceded that one and thought, well, we're not going to beat Sainz, and didn't really focus too much on Leclerc. I think they just kind of thought either Leclerc was going to get him or he wasn't. I just don't think I think Leclerc's strategy just caught them off by surprise, and then all of a sudden they're out of sync, and they have the same number of stops as Leclerc needs to make, and they're still behind him.
Yeah, I agree that Leclerc's strategy caught them napping, and they didn't see that one coming. I do also think that they didn't think they had the pace for Carlos, and they conceded that. But I do think they focused too much on Mercedes, which wasn't the race they needed to focus on.
No, absolutely. Let's go to the other McLaren. We've got a really good question from Rodri Santana, and Rodri writes, was Oscar Piastri's inexperience on show today? Two big mistakes at the final chicane, and eventually lost out to Russell when under pressure on the final lap. That's a good question, because part of me agrees with this, Lee. I think Oscar Piastri, as talented as he is, and he has had a very good start to the season. You know, he's finished in P4 the last two races before today, but I still think there are moments where, you know, we were hyping him up thinking, oh, could he really challenge his teammate Lando this season with a year of experience under his belt? I think what we see on days like today, that Oscar has got to find a way that when he's not at his absolute best, that his level below that is still pretty good, and he's not making those mistakes that he was making today, which ultimately cost him not only P6 but P7 as well.
Yeah, there's definitely something in inexperience when the heat is on. Obviously, not being in this situation very often, it takes time to obviously the experience and what to do in those situations and keep a cool head. So I do think that he could improve on that, and he will improve on that. But it does, well, as you said, raises the questions about, well, if you take it to Lando, those years of experience that Lando has over Oscar, Lando's already gone through that, prepared that, and he knows how to react and generally keep a cool head. But then Lando unfortunately makes a few errors in qualifying, which has cost him as well. So Lando's still on his own learning journey. All drivers are. Even Fernando, at his ripe old age, is still learning, deploying Carlos's DRS trick. So it's...
Yeah, exactly that. It worked this time.
Yeah, it did. But it was a silly mistake that cost him those positions, but he will learn from it, and he probably won't make that mistake in the future.
No, absolutely great. And I think in a way, perhaps we were well, not us particular, but a lot of people that were hyping up Oscar were probably underestimating Lando's ability. And I think Lando has proven that whilst at times it might have been close between him last year, and even then I think that was a bit exaggerated, because I think Lando was most of the season quite a bit ahead of his teammate. As impressive as Oscar Piastri is, I still think he's got a long way to go. And I think he's learning in a good way. You know, despite the fact he made a mistake or two today, which ultimately cost him track position against Russell and Alonso, he is in that baptism of fire. He is learning to compete with the best drivers in the best machinery week in, week out. And he's doing fine. You know, he's certainly not struggling. But this would be another day where perhaps he could look back on a few incidents where he made mistakes and it's like, could have finished in the top 6 today, but it didn't quite work out for me. So, no, I think it will serve him well. Speaking of Fernando Alonso, Lee, I think we should move on to him, because in the Australian Grand Prix review, when we discussed that Alonso-Russell incident, at the time, we were very much on the side of, why have the stewards really punished him here? I don't understand what's going on. It's a bit crazy. And I think it's fair to say that as human beings, providing we're open-minded enough to acknowledge this and try to look at data beyond an original decision, that we do have the ability and capability of changing their minds. And I think we, as human beings, probably are able to do that. And looking back on that Alonso incident, some of the comments that I'd made probably, well, they weren't bad, but I think my opinion has really changed in that incident. And I think looking at the data and looking at the onboard footage, looking at what Fernando was trying to do and ultimately didn't really pull it off, I can understand why they gave him that penalty. I do still believe that they have opened themselves up, the stewards, to a little bit of criticism on consistency issues, because we've got a good question on that today, and we got it from Alessandro44, who writes, The stewards were happy for Alonso to slow down deliberately in the DRS zones to help Piastri so that he could defend from Russell, but aren't happy when Alonso does it to Russell in Melbourne because George Russell crashed on his own accord. Make it make sense, please. I think it's as simple as what Alonso did in Melbourne, his driving standards, was over the line a little bit, but enough to warrant a penalty. But doing what he did today, nothing wrong with that at all. That's what you're supposed to do. That's when you do it right. That's how it should be. What he did in Melbourne, it would have been right if he'd have done it properly, but he made a mistake, and obviously what happened. It's as simple as that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's also a slight difference in how he lifted off. Obviously, in Melbourne, that was into a braking zone. About 130R is in the braking zone. So that could have just easily been effectively a lift and coast. And I don't know how he did it or where the delta time was lost.
Well, he did it just before the DRS zone, didn't he?
Oh,
So
yeah,
it was
he
at
did.
a point where it's like it's lifting off a little bit earlier before they go to that point. Just so, and he's doing it like relatively safely. It's not like he's braking. Oh, I've got to go back on the throttle and then brake again. If he does that like he did in Melbourne, then fair enough.
That's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah.
It's not a braking zone. It's just he came off the accelerator and the gap closed momentarily, which was enough for the DRS. It wasn't in a unsafe manner, as you said, of the back on the accelerator, brake, and it's the way it should be done.
Yeah, simple as that.
He's learned his lesson.
He's learned his lesson, clearly. He's had a lot of time to think about over the last couple of weeks. But yeah, I mean, as I said, look, I changed my opinion on what happened at Melbourne, and that's understandable. I think people have the right to do that, and they're open-minded to do it. They're happy to do it. But that was based on looking at all the data and everything that had come through following that decision, and I stick by that. But in this case, it's like, it's not the same thing. I get the stewards have opened themselves up for scrutiny on this, and perhaps they need to be a bit clearer on this than they were, but we're not going to get into this silly phase now where every time a driver does some 400 IQ tactics and pulls them off safely, everyone's going to say, oh, that's allowed, but that isn't allowed. Why is this allowed and why is that not allowed? It just doesn't really get you anywhere. And we see so much of that in live sport, not just Formula One. And it's like, what does it serve? Just debate people on social media to click on your tweet and respond so you get some clout off of it? Like, who really cares? Honestly, Fernando doesn't. I'm pretty certain George doesn't care. Oscar certainly doesn't care. So, there you go. Let's move on. We might as well talk about Mercedes. Lee, we've mentioned them a few times already. We got a question on Mercedes as well from Mandeep Khan, and Mandeep writes, did Mercedes mess up their race by changing to the hards on the restart instead of staying on the mediums that they originally started the race on? So, first things first, for context, after the red flag, Mercedes were the only one of the front runners to change the tyres as the prerogative under red flag situations. You can change your tyres and ultimately get a free pit stop. Mercedes technically didn't have to stop again when they put the hard tyres on because they started on the mediums. Everybody else at the front stayed on the tyres they originally started on. And, Mercedes were going to try and go long. They did it last year with George Russell doing the one stopper. That seemed to work out relatively well for him. Not so much today, but I do think Mercedes probably, or Russell certainly probably outperformed where that car was capable of. I think by finishing ahead of Piastri and challenging Alonso, I think he probably did a better job than they were expecting him to.
Yeah, I think regarding the strategy choice, I think the logic at the time was sound. Obviously, no one knew anything because it was limited Friday running. But generally, hotter conditions means it's going to be higher tyre wear, and then a harder tyre means you last longer and therefore go longer. So the logic behind the strategy choice was sound. They were trying to one stop, and that would have made choice. But the problem is if they deviated, then they don't get any gain from the strategy choice, and they lose out from changing strategy. So they were stuck. Once they committed, they were stuck in a rock and a hard place until they decided it wasn't working and they needed a two stop. And George did a brilliant recovery from that point once they put the second stop. And I do agree. I think he outperformed where the car was doing, although Lewis was closing the gap quite rapidly once he'd also stopped as well. But I think the medium tyre probably was being a better choice to stay on like the rest of the field and not committing to the hard tyre after the red flag. But that's with hindsight. There was no data to make an informed decision. They did a gamble and it didn't work.
No, exactly that. And Mercedes were kind of had their hands tied on this because the medium tyres that both Hamilton and Russell put on at the end of the race, which saw them really improve and get closer to the field, and obviously Russell passing Piastri, was the tyre that they both originally started the race on and only did 1 or 2 laps on. So, Bernie Collins made a great point with Sky F1 on this, that the harder tyre was considered to be the better race tyre, but the problem was FP2 was completely washed out. So all the running and all the data that they would have gathered in the session, which would have mimicked the race condition as best as possible, would have been in that session. They didn't get to do that, so a lot of it was compromised in FP3. It was a different time of the day. It would have been much earlier in the day than the race actually was. The conditions would obviously have been a bit different as well. It would have been hotter throughout the day, so the harder tyres may have looked better than they were. And because of the red flag, we lost 20 to 30 minutes of actual real-life track time, that those conditions 30 minutes beforehand may have been so much better for the harder tyre runners. The track was obviously hotter then, not so much with the wind stuff, obviously that was a bit up and down throughout the weekend, but the track was progressively getting cooler. And as Bernie Collins said, every time the track goes down 1 degree in temperature, those medium tyres become a better race tyre than the harder tyre, to the point where we end up seeing Charles Leclerc doing a 28-lap stint on medium tyres, which nobody thought was realistic. And everyone thought, maybe, or Pirelli thought you could do 50 laps on those hard tyres. As we saw from Mercedes, Lee, they couldn't do anywhere near half of that, let alone the full 50 laps. So, yeah, it was a gamble, I think, worth taking for Mercedes, because I think on pure pace, they wouldn't have finished any higher than they actually did if they just stuck to the same strategy as everybody else. But, no, I don't think they missed up Russell's race at all. If anything, I think it actually did him a favour, but it just took all the way until the end where they had to go for it and just be aggressive, where he actually got rewarded for it.
Yeah, that definitely the reward for it, but it also makes unfortunate the case for Mercedes that they're the 4th or 5th fastest team, and their expectations for this season is nowhere near where they thought they'd be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Toto is, he keeps saying that, what's happening on the sim and what's happening on our data is not being reflected on the track. And I'm like, well, we've been to 4 races now. How much longer before you get to the point and just say, you know what, guys, maybe we're just not doing this job right. Maybe it's not happening for us. I'm sure Mercedes probably feel that way and they don't really want to come out and admit it, but that's pretty much what we're seeing at the moment. Hamilton was saying after the race that apparently him and Leclerc had a little coming together quite early on and he lost a bit of downforce because of the damage and that compromised his race. Maybe that's why he let George Russell go, because he was quite proactive on the radio saying, should I let George through? Not even instigating team orders. He was thinking of that consciously. So that kind of makes sense that perhaps Hamilton felt that he wasn't going to make the strategy work being the lead car. Russell had to go for it. Proved to be the right call because George was able to get some extra points for the team, but it just edifies how difficult things are for Mercedes right now. The only car that they're regularly beaten out of the top teams is Stroll, and that's because Stroll is absolutely dreadful at the moment by his standards.
Yeah, which is the case for that. They probably could be the 5th fastest team. It's just Stroll isn't a clear example of the Aston Martin have a good car and then Fernando's doing well, or have a okay car and Fernando's doing even better. So it's not a clear pool set to justify them, but which position they are. But they're definitely behind Ferrari and McLaren.
I'd agree with you. I think they probably are 5th fastest. I think the car itself is faster than Aston Martin, but I think Aston Martin are able to get that performance out of their car, and especially Alonso, more so than Russell and Hamilton, because Alonso's great, but if Russell and Hamilton are struggling to extract that performance out of that car week in, week out, and Alonso's able to do what he's doing, look, Fernando's great, but I don't think he's beating both Mercedes cars if Mercedes are able to extract the performance out of the car that they think they're doing, or they should be doing, and that's just the reality of the situation right now. They're just, for the 3rd year in a row, they're just really struggling at the moment, and I'm not really sure what they're going to be able to do to fix this right now, and it has to be soon because, again, we are getting to that point where if they haven't figured it out yet, they're just not going to figure it out at all in this rule set.
Yeah, because there's only 1 more year left and it resets, and they might as well, in the next coming months, they'll get to the point they'll give up on this year, and then they'll probably give up on next year as well. Do the bare minimum so they can use maximum resources for 26.
Yeah, pretty much. Before we get to reacting to our predictions, Lee, we got one, not really a question, but we got a quote from MCX Andre F1. And he writes, Stroll complaining on the radio about lack of straight line speed whilst being a lap behind his teammate and scrapping with the Saubers and Hasses for P11 is the most hilarious thing about today's race. Did you see this? Stroll's on the radio, and I think he did this before he made a pit stop for the new soft tyres toward the end when he was trying to hunt Tsunoda down. But I did have to laugh when he was moaning about straight line speed. I think they went a bit too aggressive on the downforce for Lance instead of having a bit more straight line speed on the circuit. But I just thought it was just ironic. I just thought, wouldn't it be funny on the radio? And I'm sure they wouldn't have done this because if his engineer had said this, Stroll's dad probably would have fined him. But it is quite funny when Stroll is complaining about lack of straight line speed when his teammate is literally doing wonders in that car and Stroll's absolutely nowhere. Week after week, he's just nowhere to be found.
Yeah, definitely. I think I don't know who created the meme, but I saw a meme after the qualifying on Saturday, and it was like Homer Simpson building a barbecue in the garden.
Oh,
and it's like looking up, and it's Stroll looking at Fernando, and it's like, oh, that's brilliant. I love it. Then he takes it down. Why doesn't mine look like that? Because he's 1.5 seconds behind Fernando. And I think, unfortunately, that's the situation Stroll's got himself in, that he doesn't understand the difference in the delta times. Even looking at the data, it's like, how is Fernando finding that time? Because I can't find it. But it's there because Fernando's doing it. And I think he's getting stuck in his head and he's spiraling a little bit because he just can't figure out where that performance gain is.
Yeah, I do love a good Simpsons meme, and that pretty much says it all at the moment. It really, really does. Final part, before we do the predictions, Lee, a quick one for Driver of the Day. There was a few shouts for Charles Leclerc. Yuki Tsunoda was given a few nominations as well. Even Perez, I think, got a few votes. Who was your Driver of the Day today?
Ooh, for me, I would have picked Tsunoda.
No, fair enough. Sorry, I thought you were going to give me a reason.
No, I wasn't going to give a reason.
Oh, okay, fair. Sorry, I jumped the gun there. Like Norris in Jeddah, jumped the gun a bit, but there you go.
Yeah, right, no penalty.
George Russell didn't complain about it, so it's all good.
But yeah, Tsunoda obviously had a great drive, and obviously managed to be the first point scorer since Kobayashi, a Japanese point scorer, I should say. Obviously, there's other point scorers in B over the years. And there was just obviously a solid performance. And as we said earlier when we talked about Yuki, he's really showing his talent, and it's really enjoyable to see. And everyone should enjoy when a driver does well at the home race, because you think if you were that person, you want to do well at a home race, and having that the only Japanese driver in the grid performing well at the home race, I really hope he really felt good and proud, and the crowd obviously enjoyed his performance, and I think he thoroughly deserved it to be the driver of the day. Obviously, he wasn't the official one, but he was my chosen driver of the day.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree. Although I will say I thought Leclerc was driver of the day, but the issue I have with Leclerc being driver of the day is, as brilliant as his drive was, it's like, well, he's recovering from P8 to P4. Should have probably started somewhere along the lines of P4 and seen what he could have really done. But, he did a great job on Sunday. We just need to get that Saturday performances back to where they normally are. So, no, I agree. I'm happy to give it to Tsunoda. Got to feel those vibes for Yuki, and he did a great job in front of his home crowd. Let's now turn to our predictions. So, unfortunately, because Courtney's not with us, probably not going to be able to count this on the show, but I will go back and check what he had done so I can give him his points if he did score any on this one. But we'll focus on ours. And at the moment, Lee, you're leading 3-1 at the moment in the predictions race. So let's see how we do this weekend. So, biggest good surprise for 1 point. Who did you go with?
I went with Carlos Sainz, and I went to specifically said that he finishes ahead of Charles, which he did. So
he did. I'm happy to give that. Yeah, I mean, I did say on the show to quantify that I think he has to get a podium, and he did. So simple as that, really. So 1 point for you.
Thank you, Carlos.
Point for Carlos, another point for him. I went with Yuki Tsunoda. And I said top 10 finish for Tsunoda, and he absolutely delivered. So that's a point for me. So I can't remember the last time you and I did a good surprise and both of us were right on that one. So I think that's a big
We
one
both
for
get a
us.
bonus point. Courtney's not here to disagree.
He can argue about it in the YouTube comments if he disagrees with us. But no, I think we'll be nice. No, we'll do, as I said, 1 point for both of us. I think Courtney went with Alex Albon. As I said, I'm going to check his later on and see how many points he did and update everybody for the Chinese Grand Prix preview. So, biggest flop. So, who did you go with, Lee? Who was your big flop?
My flop was Logan Sargent, and I believe he was a flop this weekend.
I'm not sure if he was the biggest one, though, was he? Because he did.
Whoa.
I mean, he had that moment at Degna 2, but
He also crashed it through practice. He was also the last runner of the week, the race.
but still had a better weekend than his teammate.
True. I still
Not
think
that
it's a
I'm
flop.
suggesting something here that Williams were wrong to do what they did to Logan, but I can't really. I know it's just the two of us, but I can't really give a point for that one.
Oh, where's Courtney when he's here?
Well, this is it. You need to canvass for him because he went for Sargent as well, and you could have dominated the room. You could have dominated the panel, but he's not here. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to pull rank and say no. Sorry, I can't do that. I, on the other hand, went with Daniel Ricciardo. I think that's worth a point, is it not?
No, he didn't flop. I can't accept that.
Well, I mean,
we said it wasn't at fault of the accident. We can't accept that.
I'm going by the fact that most people on social media felt that Ricciardo was at fault for that incident. The fact that he didn't even get past the first few corners and played his part in that. He's as equally culpable as Albon is, and for that reason, I think I get a point for that one. So, yeah, nice point for me. So, yeah, who'd have thought Daniel Ricciardo scores me a point this weekend, so that's nice. Hopefully he can get back on track soon. I hate seeing him as bad as he is at the moment, but come on, Danny Rick, we know you can do it. Let's move on to the qualifying predictions. We all said Max Verstappen was pole position. I don't even need to ask you, Lee. We all did that.
Yeah.
Tried to do it in unison, didn't manage it once again. So point for all of us on that one. So well done us. I think Courtney's off the mark now, so that's good. Top three. If I remember rightly, I think Courtney put Leclerc on the podium, so that didn't come in. I think the two Red Bulls are first and second. I went with the two Red Bulls first and second, and then Leclerc on the podium, so I don't get a point for that. Who did you go with?
I went with Max to win, which he obviously did, but I went for a double Ferrari podium, which I didn't get. Unfortunately, Ferrari.
I love your podiums because they're just literally full of Ferraris on them. It's brilliant. But unfortunately,
yeah, but Ferrari's letting me down. I know how you feel
one of them is. One of them is at the moment, but it's not the one that you like. So there you go. No, unfortunately, as much as I'd love to reward you with a point for that one, Lee, Carlos P3, Leclerc P4, and obviously Max was the only one out of the three that was in the right position. Shock. So no points for any of us. We have to get all three of them in the correct positions. And then it leaves us to our bold predictions. So what was your bold prediction, Lee?
It was a double Ferrari podium.
Didn't you say that Ferrari would be leading or Ferrari would be leading one of the two championships this weekend?
I think that was Courtney.
Oh, what a shame. Would have loved for that one to be a thing, but never mind. I think Perez is now P2 in the Drivers' Championship. So Red Bull stretching their legs once again. Double podium for Ferrari didn't come in. My one was a bit different. I said Sauber would manage to get all their pit stops done in 3 seconds or less. Like each one, obviously not all of them together. That would be insane. I don't even think they did one in less than 3 seconds this weekend. I think the first one was Bottas's one, and that was 4 seconds because of the wheel nut. And I remember watching it, I was like, oh, for goodness sake. I stuck my neck out for Sauber, and they've done me literally in a lap.
Still quicker than 50 seconds, so it's an improvement.
It is an improvement. I think Ted Kravitz was being sarcastic, and he said Bottas has come in, it's an improvement of 50 seconds, it's 8 seconds. I'm like, Ted, come on, it can't be that. And then they did the replay, said, that's not 8 seconds, and it said 4. I'm like, well, it's hardly any better. It's like 2 seconds slower than like everybody else at the moment. So, yeah, unfortunately, no points for me on the bold prediction either. I'm sure Sauber will have a faultless weekend for pit stops and just have all of them below 3 seconds. But at this rate, it may just come from having one pit stop in the entire race and then that's it. That might be the only way it happens, unfortunately.
It will come eventually. They just need to sort out their wheel nuts. I wouldn't be surprised if that's not till the European season, leg of the season.
Yeah, very, very true. It's not so easy to fix, unfortunately, and that is causing him a lot of problems. So, might not be the first time I throw that bold prediction out there. I just hope I have better luck with it than
You
I did
keep
this
using
weekend.
it until you finally get.
I might have to, just for the sake of, just for the fun of it. Like, it's bound to come in eventually. They're bound to do it at some point. They're too good to be, I know we joke about some teams obviously aren't as good as some of the elite, but they're all very, very good at what they do. So obviously it's not like they're a bunch of imbeciles running around and, like Crofty making jokes like the one he made at Melbourne about nuts running around all those places, all that silly stuff that we can't repeat because this is a family show and like to keep it that way. But yeah. So overall, I think if I remember rightly, so Courtney, if I remember right, how many points did he get? He got 1 point for Max, or Max pole position. So he's on 1 now for the season. He's off the mark. So I didn't remember what he did, so that's good. I think I got 3, didn't I? Because I got Max Verstappen, Ricciardo as the flop, and Tsunoda top 10. So that's 3 points for me. And for you, Lee, you got 2 points for Carlos Sainz and for Max Verstappen. So that puts you on 5, and that puts me on 4. So I'm nipping at the heels there. So I'm right back in the game. Courtney's on 1, but obviously we had a 1 race head start, so we may have to average that out for him to try and level the playing field a bit, but we shall see. Let us know how your predictions are going on, guys. Obviously, we encourage you to take part as well, but let us know. This is going on YouTube, by the way, so hopefully you guys will be able to let me know in the comments how you're getting on. But that's all we got time for, I'm afraid. We'll be back soon with some more content. The next race, of course, the Chinese Grand Prix in a couple of weeks' time. So obviously there'll be plenty to talk about in the meantime. But until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in as always. Please stay safe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. Take care.
Goodbye.